I can hear the hum of the fluorescent lights across the store now. I never used to be able to. Or maybe I always could, but subconsciously filtered out the sound. Either way, I can't afford to be unobservant anymore. I have to remain in the present moment at all times. I used to love being lost in my own world, imagining stories and exciting scenarios. As I swept the floors, restocked the inventory, and even interacted with customers from behind the counter, there would always be some percentage of my brain off doing its own thing. Those days are over. The ignorant illusion of safety I've been living in has now been irreparably torn away. I'm a 25-year-old man, finishing my last year at university, going for a degree in criminal justice. I'm pretty solidly built, not a bodybuilder by any means, but I do work out a few times per week, and that probably makes me stronger than your average guy. So I was never really afraid working the overnight shift. I always figured I could handle myself against any late-night weirdos who wander in. And with what I've learned about the criminal mind through my studies, I thought I knew the signs to be on the lookout for. But I was wrong. I had assumed simple robbery and maybe a few obstinate drunks were the worst problems I would ever have to deal with. That was before I understood that evil takes many forms. It all started about a month ago, one night around 11 p.m. I remember the time because Sharissa, my fellow store employee, had just clocked out for the night. She works the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, and my shift starts at 10 p.m. So we see one another all the time, but only for an hour. I knew she worried about going to her car alone at night, despite the jokes she would make about it. So each night I walk her out to her car and try to lighten the mood. She isn't comfortable in the dark employee parking area at the far end of the lot near a thick clump of trees. Each night I temporarily close and lock the doors to the store while both of us are gone. On that night, after saying goodbye, she hopped in the driver's seat and I turned and started back towards the store. A few steps into my journey, my shoulders hunched against the biting January air, I glanced up. It was already standing in front of the double glass doors, a black silhouette against the yellow light from the store. The dark shape stood tall, wearing a long black coat and a wide-brimmed hat. It almost looked like a mobster from an old gangster movie or something. Its back was to me, as it stood just staring into the store. As I drew closer, the dark shadow didn't turn to the sound of my steps. I could feel my heart beating faster as I approached, eventually standing right next to it to unlock the door. As I fumbled with my keys, the dark stranger finally turned to look at me. A man's pale face with a vacant, dead look in his eyes was just barely visible through the shadows. For just a second, it was as if I were standing next to a corpse, with no expression whatsoever or the faintest hint of life in its eyes. And then it smiled. For the first time in my life, I watched the supernatural reveal itself right in front of me. The smile stretched too far. It wasn't just a big smile, it was an impossible smile. The closed mouth extended almost all the way to the earlobes on both sides of his head. My eyes grew wide and my heart was pounding in my ears. Almost instantly, as if it realized it had overstepped the bounds of normal human behavior, the smile vanished and the face returned to its previous dead expression. I didn't know what to say or what to do. I felt that commenting on the impossible smile would only encourage it to come back, and that was the last thing I wanted. There was only one thing I was sure of. I wasn't standing next to a human. I stood next to an it, not a he. I just reverted to doing what I was already going to do, because that's all I could think of. Wordlessly, I walked past him, unlocked the doors, and went inside, heading quickly to the counter at the front of the store, as if the short wall and cash register would somehow protect me from whatever was happening. When I reached the cash register and turned around, I saw the store remained empty. But the man, or thing, or whatever it was, still stood outside, still looking in through the glass doors. For the longest time it stood motionless, keeping its stare on me. I stared back, unable to move, caught completely off guard on what to do in this situation. And then it turned and walked off, back into the parking lot. I watched as it walked across the spot where Shariss's car was usually parked and into the thick clump of trees nearby. I continued to stand there, unable to understand what had happened or how fear had somehow radiated from it. It wasn't just because of its disturbing appearance and freakish expressions. I had felt the fear even before I had seen its face, or the unnerving, too-wide smile. And now, even after it was gone, I was afraid. For the next several hours, I anxiously looked up whenever I saw someone approaching the doors. Each time it was just another customer, bundled up in a heavy coat and ready to make a quick, wordless purchase before heading back into the night. I didn't know what to do, or if I should tell anyone about what had happened. Would they just think I was crazy? I glanced at the security camera pointed at the front door and shook my head. The store cameras are a joke. None of them still work. They leave them up for appearance's sake, so people at least think they're being recorded. But the store I work for is part of a dying brand. The money has long since dried up as we're outperformed by the newer, bigger stores. But somehow the remaining stores limp on, eking out profits too small to spare the expense of having our security cameras repaired, which left me with no way to prove what I had seen. It wasn't until about 2 a.m. that I saw it again. I was restocking the medicine on the shelf nearest the counter, glancing over towards the doors every couple of minutes. The next time I looked, it was standing there in front of the glass doors, just staring at me. I jumped backwards, tripping over the basket holding the new meds and falling on my butt, bottles of pain relievers clattering and rolling all across the floor. I scrambled back to my feet as I heard the door chime. As soon as my head popped over the aisle, I saw the doors were still closed. That alone was odd, because if someone entered the store, the doors usually took a few seconds to close, and I should have seen at least some movement to show they were closing. But they remained stone still, with the figure outside now gone. Was he inside the store now? I stood motionless and strained my senses for any trace of movement. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then I heard a soft slapping sound, like flesh on the tile floor, like someone was crawling around on their hands and feet. I ran behind the counter again, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. There was nothing. My best bet was to call the police, but how long would that take? The thing was here now. The slapping sounds increased in speed and intensity, as I heard it crawling along the furthest parts of the store, almost as fast as a person could run standing up. I grabbed a magazine and rolled it up in my hand, while a small, isolated part of my brain laughed at how utterly useless that was. It just felt better to have something in my hand, a small extension that I could keep between myself and this thing. It was a tiny comfort psychologically, even if it wasn't going to help physically. The fleshy slapping sounds increased even further in speed as whatever it was came to the very last aisle. I braced myself for whatever was about to appear, but all the sounds suddenly stopped. He was still there. It was still there, just behind the last aisle. The store grew supernaturally quiet. I couldn't even hear the ticking of the clock behind me. Then, in slow motion, like a nightmare coming to life, the head came into view. It wasn't low to the ground, like someone on all fours. It was near the top of the aisle and rising ever higher. It was wearing the same wide-brimmed hat as before, but the face was almost totally unrecognizable. The eyes were wide open, staring. At first, I thought they were entirely white, until I spotted the black pinprick pupils in the center of each. The smile was back, this time a full-blown grin with the lips pulled back and teeth exposed. They were entirely normal-looking human teeth, but there are far too many of them, stretching from ear to ear in a hideous parody of a smile. I saw as it slowly came around the corner that it was still rising from being on all fours, but its neck had stretched out to an infeasible length, putting its head near the ceiling. The limbs, too, were growing, stretching out longer with each passing second. And then it was as if my body took over, when my brain no longer knew what to do. My primal instinct to survive kicked in, and I was sprinting down the store. Not towards the front doors, which were still too close to the thing, but to the walk-in refrigerator on the far right side, where we keep all the cold drinks in storage. The door itself was thick, heavy and solid, but the room it led into was far from secure. The entire wall on one side was made of easily opened glass doors, with only the trays of drinks between the inside and out. But I didn't know where else to go. It was between me and the exit. I could hear the thing scrambling around on the floor outside the walk-in, so I slammed the door and locked it from the inside. Then I ran down the refrigerated aisle until I reached the small walk-in freezer in the very back. I paused. The freezer had a thick metal door every bit as solid as the walk-in fridge, and it had no glass walls or even windows. It undoubtedly looked more secure and would hide me better. But I also knew that without my coat, I wouldn't be able to stay in there for very long. It also didn't lock from the inside like the walk-in door could, so it really wasn't any safer. I stood by the freezer door, shaking hand on the lever, ready to open it and run inside at the first hint that something else would enter the walk-in. I waited, trembling as much from fear as the cold, my vision occasionally slightly obscured from my breath turning into condensation in the air. After what seemed like hours, I heard the front door chime again. Was that the thing leaving? Or did someone new come in? A few moments later, I heard a male voice call out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" I relaxed just a little. If the thing was still out there, this new person would have seen it. I walked over to the trays of soda and peered between them, through the glass door and out into the store. It seemed empty, save for one short, bulky person wandering up to the counter. With shaky legs, I walked towards the door and unlatched it. I held onto it at first for fear it would suddenly be pulled open by a great force and the thing would be standing there. But nothing happened, except for the man calling out for service one more time. "Hey, I need a pack of cigarettes. Is anyone here?" I slowly pulled the walk-in door open to see no unearthly terrors waiting on the other side. The store seemed as normal as it ever had. I slowly walked out and turned towards the counter. "Oh, there you are," the stout, Hispanic-looking man exclaimed. "Yeah, can I get you okay, pal?" I looked at the concern written across his face. "Yeah." My voice came out in almost a whisper, raspy and a little shaky. "You're as pale as a ghost," he laughed nervously. "You sure you're okay?" I continued my trek to the front of the store, quietly passing him and entering behind the counter. "Yeah," I said again, a little more strength in my voice this time. "What brand did you want?" he told me, and as I was handing them over, he said, "Must be working too many overnights, eh, pal? Make sure you get a good night's rest when you can." His smile faded quickly when I didn't return it, and he quickly pocketed the pack and left the store. As he left, I saw the glowing red numbers on the clock above the slowly closing exit doors read 4:08 a.m. I was alone in the store again, or so I hoped. An hour and a half later, Patrick, the manager, came in for his shift and allowed me to clock out a bit early when I told him I didn't feel well. He's a nice guy. We've never had any problems, but there's no way I could tell him what happened. I didn't think there was a way to tell anyone what happened. I walked out to my car, eyes darting everywhere, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Quickly, I unlocked my trusty old Honda's driver's side door and slid behind the wheel, before whirling to check the back seat, just in case. A few empty protein packets on the backseat floor were all that lay behind me. I slowly turned and drew a deep breath, closing my eyes, forcing myself to be calmer. I had felt helpless, almost hopeless for most of the night, a part of me believing that I wouldn't see the morning sun again. Now that it was here, I felt my resolve and strength gently rise with it. I didn't know what exactly had happened, but I was determined to never feel that way again. Many people would have perhaps quit this job by this point, but I didn't want to. And it wasn't out of bravery, or because I needed minimum wage money so desperately that I was willing to face an unspeakable horror. But it was because of that unspeakable horror that I knew I had to stay. For the rest of my life, I knew I would be looking over my shoulder, fearing the dark. I could run, but I would never really stop running, at least not in my mind. I wanted to face this thing head on. I was a criminal justice major. I had always wanted to defeat evil. I had to win so I could be free. I did not want to ever feel the same way I had a few hours earlier, and it was up to me, and me alone, to take steps to ensure that. I had never before felt my world shaken like this. I had felt a sense of confidence in almost everything I did, and I was ready to reclaim that feeling by defeating what made me afraid. First things first, I thought. I would need to bring my Glock 19 into work for my next shift. The small but powerful handgun would be easy to conceal, Patrick would never agree to an employee bringing a gun inside the store, but fortunately, he usually isn't even working when I come in, and it's not like Sharissa gives me pat-downs each shift to make sure I don't have weapons. Maybe I'll never need it. I hope I won't, I thought, but one thing I do know for sure, I won't be running next time. If I saw the thing again, I'd hold it at gunpoint while recording it with my phone. Once I had all the evidence I needed, I'd call the police and let them look at it. That was plan A. But if the thing rushed me, well, a disgusting, distorted dead monster is pretty good evidence as well. Hey, maybe I'll even get famous from this. I could figure out a way to make money from it. I hope the thing does show up again tonight. This could turn out to be a good thing in the long run. The thoughts comforted me, increasing my resolve to actually return for my shift that night. I slept like a log as soon as I got home. The adrenaline that had pumped through me earlier had drained me thoroughly. Upon waking to the alarm on my phone that evening, I was pleased to find the confidence was still there. By the time I was driving back to the store for my next overnight shift, I felt ready, powerful even. Nothing was going to stop me, but as I pulled up into the employee parking area, I felt that earlier sense of confidence and bravery drain right back out of me, as the setting of the sun seemed to take with it the same resolve and strength it had brought me that morning. My gut had turned into a cold, hollow void. I was feeling less like a warrior and very much like a scared little kid with a gun. As I got out of the car, I tucked the gun into the back of my pants and made sure my shirt covered it. As I approached the double glass doors, both of them appearing pale orange in the dying light, I realized my heart was not only pounding because of what I feared I might have to face at night, but also that I would be caught bringing a gun into the store. To my relief, Sharissa was busy restocking in the walk-in when I entered, so I had a few minutes before she came back out. There were no customers in the store. I went behind the counter and pulled the gun out. I hid it against the wall of the counter, behind a big stack of old magazines. The rest of the hour that Sharissa and I worked together, I was tense, as I feared by some freak accident she would discover the gun hidden beneath the counter. But as I walked her out to her car once again, I felt that uneasiness fade. It was replaced by a deeper, colder feeling, one that made my first fear seem almost childlike by comparison. The worst-case scenario of Sharissa finding a gun was that she'd report me to our boss, and I'd get fired. Big deal. The worst-case scenario of everything else that was about to happen was something so terrible that I could not allow my mind to go there. The night plunged on into deeper darkness, as it seemed fewer than normal amounts of people came into the store. The tiny sense of safety I'd hoped to derive from being with other people was overridden by my new understanding of reality. These people were all living in the same delusion of relative safety that I had been living under. A part of me longed to return to the ignorant bliss that I had only 24 hours earlier, but another part of me knew that the illusion of safety did not protect me from this thing I couldn't understand. The small trickle of customers throughout the night slowly died out, and just after midnight, I was totally alone again. I listened to the now audible buzzing of the lights across the store, knowing I really needed to restock a few of the shelves. But somehow afraid to leave the counter, I stood behind. It hadn't saved me before, but it just somehow felt safer to be there. And of course, the gun was closer. I bent down and checked behind the stack of magazines for the 100th time, ensuring that the gun was indeed still there. I kept half expecting it to have fallen to some other area, but each time I looked, it was still in the exact same place. As I straightened, a flicker of movement caught my eye from the store windows on the right-hand side. I turned to see the same thing from the night before, walking along the outside of the store to the front doors. It was in its fully human shape at first, but I watched as it passed between each window, the neck and limbs each growing slightly longer and more distorted with each window it passed. Panicked, I reached under the counter and grabbed the gun. As I looked up again, I saw it outside the double glass doors, now on all fours, distorted and oddly bent limbs twisting and turning in all directions. The head had the same pinpoint, wild-eyed stare, and the mouth was opening into the same grin, this time with the mouth opening more. I could see now that not only did it have far too many human-like teeth stretching from side to side, but also into the mouth. Layers upon layers of molar-like teeth covered the fleshy tunnel. It suddenly let out a shriek that sounded like a woman's scream mixed with a pig's squeal. It burst through the doors and charged straight up the center aisle towards me. I raised the gun and fired, round after round, in the general direction of the creature. I'm embarrassed to say it now, but I closed my eyes the entire time. Once I had the gun aimed, I just couldn't bear to look at the thing charging me for a millisecond. Longer, and I squeezed my eyes shut as I pulled the trigger over and over again. I stopped when I heard the clicking of an empty chamber each time I pulled the trigger, and nothing else. I opened my eyes. The creature lay on the ground, having shifted back into its human-shaped form, but pouring out of its head, arms and legs was a thick black smoke. It spewed the thick, almost solid mixture up into the air, where it seemed to be pulled backwards through the glass doors and up into the night sky. I stood, disbelieving as the last of the black smoke left the human shape and vanished. The corpse of a man, or at least what looked like a man, lay on the floor, his body riddled with bullet holes, blood pooling on the floor. Uh-oh. This was not good. This was really not good. I had killed the thing that stalked me, but to absolutely anyone else it was going to look like I just murdered a customer, and I had no proof of the supernatural to show otherwise. Yet another kind of fear entered my body, this one a panicky, guilty sort. What was I going to do? What could I do? And in that moment, I resolved to do what I knew was best. Others would not understand what I did, but of course I understood, and I couldn't let the obvious confusion that others would have had slow me down. The trash truck always came at 5 a.m., and they just used machines to lift the dumpsters into the truck. They never checked them. And that was the only way to dispose of the body that I could think of. I quickly wrapped the body in plastic trash bags and dragged it out to the dumpster, all the while fearing an approaching customer would spot me. But no one came as I dragged the body outside, or as I struggled to heave it over the side of one of the two giant metal dumpsters behind the store. I ran back inside as soon as I had heaved it over, fearing a customer might arrive at any moment and ask what I was doing. But there was no one, and I was left alone to scrub the floor and battle with my fear-ridden, guilty thoughts. What will happen if the body is discovered and traced back to me? Will there be any sign during an autopsy that it isn't really a man? Or maybe it is a man, possessed by some dark force that left after I killed him, leaving him as a very human corpse. I shook my head. Whatever the case may be, I was attacked and completely justified in my actions. Whether I killed a monster in the shape of a man, or an evil force able to take control and manipulate the body of a man, the fact that I had to kill it was undeniable. There's no telling who it could have killed after it was finished with me. I had probably just protected a lot more people along with myself. Nevertheless, the haunting guilt and fear followed me for the rest of the night. It was nearly as much of a relief to see Patrick entering the store to relieve me when morning came, as it had been the morning before. I had already pocketed all the shell casings, and I only found one missed shot, which had buried itself in a large package of flour near the store entrance. I bought that flour package myself and already had it stored in my car. I drove home, feeling the early morning light on me, and a small sense of accomplishment within me started to grow. I had done it. I had faced my fear and defeated it, saving who knows how many other lives in the process. As with the morning before, I felt completely drained, but the guilt and fear were fading away entirely, leaving me with a sense of achievement. As soon as I arrived home, I went to bed and slept deeply. To my pleasant surprise, the feeling of accomplishment was still with me when I woke up, even though I realized I had been sleeping for an unexpected 10 hours. It was with me as I did the assignments on my last few classes, as I cleaned my apartment, and as I got ready for work. I brought my gun with me again, less for protection this time and more like a trophy. It was like my friend. It had brought me through a really dark, scary experience, and now I was happy to keep it with me. I walked through the double glass doors confidently this time, after I arrived at work. I talked and laughed with Charissa, stocked the shelves and swept the floors, and found myself feeling more like my old self. No, better than my old self. I felt almost on top of the world. I suppose that happens when you come through the other side of a life or death experience. But it wouldn't last. Later that evening, after Sharisa had left and I was the lone employee once again, what looked to be a dad and his two young daughters came inside. The girls, who looked to be around 6 or 7 years old, browsed the candy aisle, while the dad went to the refrigerated section where we keep alcoholic drinks. I smiled at the girls as they quietly whispered to each other about their favorite candy. They were both so quiet. They almost appeared to be a little scared. I looked over at the dad. He had stopped looking at the beer and had turned his head to face me. I watched as he slowly smiled at me, the line reaching from ear to ear. His eyes grew wide, the whites taking over as the pupils shrank into tiny pinpoint dots. I stared, unable to believe that I was seeing this nightmare take place again. I felt my stomach drop, and the old fear I thought I had left behind returned in full force. And then, without a word, the man or thing returned his facial features to a flat, expressionless, normal look and turned once again to look at the beer. I was stunned. I glanced over at the fearful girls who were glancing over towards his direction and then back to each other, like they were hiding from him. The gun suddenly didn't feel like a simple trophy, but once again a lifeline I would have to cling to. As I reached beneath the counter, behind the magazines, I heard him approach. My head shot back up to see him place a 6-pack of beers on the counter, his head down as he fished for his wallet. The little girls came up alongside him, each placing a bag of candy next to his beer. My heart was thudding in my chest. He looked back up at me with a strange expression, but not an inhuman one. He handed me his credit card. One hand found my gun, and I clutched it tightly as I stood up straight, gun still hidden behind the counter but pointed straight at him. With my other hand, I slowly, gingerly reached for the card. He didn't move, but continued to stare, holding the card out to me. I took it and put it in our credit card reader, looking at the name on the card. I memorized it. I ran the card through our ancient credit card reader and handed him the receipt. I've done this so many times, I can do it with one hand, which was absolutely necessary because there was no way I was going to loosen my grip on the gun beneath the counter. The girls took their bags of candy as he took his card back and scooped up the 6-pack. He looked at me again as his face contorted once again into a grisly, open-mouthed smile. I could now see the entire inside of his mouth was totally lined with teeth. My finger tightened on the trigger, shaking. Just before I could squeeze, his face reverted back to normal and he turned and walked towards the doors, the girls in front of him. The thought of shooting flashed through my mind, but I knew I might hit the girls. And before I could decide what to do, they left. I walked from around the counter and stood by the window, watching as they piled in a rusted old Jeep. When the lights came on, I could see the tag light illuminate the license plate. I memorized the sequence of letters and numbers, then ran back behind the counter and wrote them down before I could forget, along with his name. Now I had his name and his license plate number. He might come back, he might not. But at this point, I wasn't concerned about myself. I was concerned about the two little girls with him. They were apparently in the custody of a monster in human flesh. I remember their frightened eyes. I knew there was no telling what he did to them or planned to do in the near future, but I knew what I planned to do. For the average person, a license plate number would not help them find a vehicle's owner. But as a criminal justice major, I knew police often use an ALPR system to help them discover the owner of a vehicle, along with their home address. I had his name and his license plate number, and I know certain backdoor websites that use pirated ALPR programs to essentially do the same thing. I spent the next several hours on the computer behind the counter tracking him down, or at least the bag of flesh that used to house his soul. Finally, I found his address, only 15 minutes away. And so, at 3 a.m., with no one at the store, I locked the front doors and put the newly discovered address into my GPS. To make a long story short, the inhuman creature masquerading as a man will not be harming those little girls anymore. The slight fear that I had somehow killed an innocent person was relieved when the single bullet that punctured his bedroom window and his skull released a waterfall of thick, heavy black smoke. There was so much it filled the entire room and began spewing out of the tiny hole in the window. I was back at the store well before 4 a.m., my hands shaking, but that feeling of triumph returning. The evil darkness that pretends to be human is still out there, I know. I see it almost every night now, in the eyes of various people who enter the store. It's in the dark aura, the faint wisps of smoke I see exit the nostrils of some, the slightly too wide smiles of others who quickly hide them when they catch me staring. My eyes have been opened to the grim truth of the world, open to seeing the silent invasion of evil into normal-looking, everyday people. I'm not sure who to trust anymore. Even some of the regular customers, who didn't show any signs of containing evil before, are displaying clear signals now. I don't know if they were previously clean and became infected, or if they were always inhuman creatures, and I've only just gotten better at noticing. So I've done everything I can to make sure my senses stay sharp. I stopped eating junk food that only slows me down, stopped watching TV that dulls my senses. I've also stopped taking the so-called medicine that's supposed to treat me for a disease I don't have. If your senses have been sharpened, if you're more alert and awake than ever before because you stopped taking a pill, then you can bet that pill was made by one of them. I don't have paranoid schizophrenia. I never did. What I have, what I've always had, is a gift. And 10 years ago, a doctor whose insides were filled with black smoke prescribed me a drug to keep me docile, dull, and compliant. But no more. I've decided to write all this down and release it for 2 reasons. Firstly, if you're human, I want you to know there is someone out here fighting for you, fighting for all humanity. I want you to know the truth of the world and what we should all be fighting against. I want you to know the signs to look out for. The other reason is for you creatures, you demons wearing human flesh. If you're reading this, I want you to know I am here. I can see you. I want you to be afraid. I intentionally left the details of where I live and the store I work in vague so you can't track me down. But I could be anywhere. I could be in your hometown. I could be that clerk behind the counter that just took your credit card. I want you to know if you come into my convenience store, I will see you for what you really are. And once I have your information, there will be no escape.